Hi, in this session, we're going to be talking about improving access for babies, toddlers, and their caregivers. We're going to start by looking at access for whom, to what, and how, and then we're going to look at two frameworks that are going to help us understand improving access. Access, in its essence, is the integration of land use and mobility. It's where do you need to go and how are you going to get there? Other dimensions of access that are important for caregivers include safety, affordability, and service quality. Just because something is physically close doesn't mean that it's accessible. You might have a public transport stop next to you, but you can't afford to use it. You may have childcare nearby, but it's overcrowded and not a good quality, so it's not truly accessible. The first question to look at is access for whom. Caregivers represent a range of different types of people, from age to gender to income to race to religion to ability. And so when you're thinking about access for whom, you really need to unpack who do you mean from a caregiver perspective. The next thing to really think about is access to what. And so that really means land uses. And babies and toddlers have unique particular needs, and caregivers are responsible for delivering those needs. Babies and toddlers have access to particular needs. This includes healthy food sources and also open spaces for play. These are two critical components in brain development. They also have a higher need for going to doctors and pharmacies in the first few years of their life. Caregivers need access to daycares and primary schools and kindergartens. Typically, caregivers are taking care of multiple young children at different ages. So having these educational facilities nearby facilitates them taking care of the household. This also enables caregivers to get a job and go to work, which is also another thing that many households need to do. And finally, having cultural and social centers nearby and community centers is helpful for building support systems for caregivers while also giving opportunities for socialization and education to babies and toddlers. Babies and toddlers are also time-bound. They have frequent feeding and sleeping schedules. It's hard for them to take long trips, so the local environment is really important, and that local environment needs to be a healthy environment. So the foundation for a healthy environment is having good air quality, reduced noise pollution, access to basic services, and also open space for play. Babies and toddlers are also more susceptible to air quality, air pollution, and noise pollution, which affects their neurological and cognitive development. Caregivers are time constrained. They're trying to meet multiple needs of the household, and that causes stress. So you want a local environment to reduce the stress for caregivers, and in doing so, that enables them to have the time and the space to have loving and frequent interactions with their babies and toddlers. Unfortunately, the trend of urban development is towards increasing sprawl and increasing inequality, which is leading to increasing travel times and distances. We're also seeing a lot of that growth happening in the outskirts of cities, such as the case here with Dar es Salaam. In the orange and the red areas where the most growth is happening, they're tens of kilometers away from the city proper. The other thing that happens with this growth is that it tends to be informal settlements that lack access to basic services. To counter the trend of increasing sprawl while also meeting the needs of babies, toddlers, and their caregivers who are both time-bound and time-constrained, the framework for improving access through land use is really about having a mix of different services nearby. And the more frequent you use something, the closer it should be to home. So the final question that we need to look at when thinking about access is access how? And that really is your mobility options. And to really understand mobility is how far you can go in a certain amount of time, and that's going to be contingent upon the user or characteristics as well as the mode characteristics, including the conditions of travel as well as the service quality. So first, we're going to look at the trip characteristics for caregivers generally. The first factor that is affecting the trip characteristics is whether a caregiver is traveling with or without dependents, their babies and toddlers. If they're traveling with babies and toddlers, they tend to move more slowly, stop much more frequently. They tend to take shorter trips more often and travel during off-peak times. They also tend to travel with goods. Regardless of who they're traveling with, caregivers tend to trip chain. And what trip chaining means is you have multiple destinations that you go to during one trip. So in this illustration, a caregiver leaves her house, drops off her child at childcare, goes shopping, visits a relative, goes and pays a bill, and then finally goes to work. Unfortunately, traditional transportation planning centers the non-disabled male commuter, and this results in motorized travel being prioritized, as well as peak travel hours. And this leaves our streets more dangerous and more polluted with less access, even though many of the trips that we make during the day are for caregiving activities. Research in Santiago, Chile showed that 47% of all trips are made for caregiving activities, and just 16% of all trips in the US are for the commute. Walking, cycling, and public transport are the main modes for caregivers. They're the ones that they choose, and they also confer more benefits, opportunities for interacting with each other, with their environment. They offer physical activity, social connection, as well as being cleaner. So now we're going to look at the mobility characteristics, starting with walking. With walking, it's good for shorter distances. It's predictable, reliable, it's simple. It doesn't take a lot of trip planning for caregivers. It offers the ability for interaction between the caregiver and the child, as well as with the environment, and it's affordable. Some of the constraints with walking include the fact that our streets aren't really well designed. We have discontinuous, non-existent walkways. And when they do exist, they're too narrow, they're overcrowded, or they're obstructed. The crossing the street can be dangerous and chaotic, and the distances can be too long for walking to really make sense. Cycling confers many of the same benefits as walking, except you can go longer distances and you can carry more. Some of the constraints are similar to walking as well, in terms of a lack of dedicated and protected infrastructure, and intersections can be dangerous. But you also have to think about a lack of bike parking, a lack of access to bikes and child-friendly bike accessories, as well as harassment and violence and gender bias. Public transport is greater for long distances. It's also faster and more comfortable for traveling with goods and with family members. It's relatively safe. It's more safe than sometimes walking on the street. But some of the constraints are that our public transport systems are not designed for caregivers in mind. They don't have high frequency and off-peak hours. If you're a caregiver carrying a baby and you have goods and you're trying to pay the fare and also navigate up steps into a bus, it's really chaotic and it's really hectic. So public transport systems don't really meet the needs of caregivers. Just a note here, when we talk about public transport, we're talking about the full range of public transport options, all the way from intermediate modes, which are things like shared 2- and 3-wheelers, auto rickshaws, to informal modes, which include minibuses and jitneys, all the way up to bus and rail as well. So to counter the dominance of private motor vehicle planning and in our streets, as well as meet the needs of caregivers for flexibility and babies and toddlers for engagement and activity, the framework for improving access through mobility is focused on walking first, but ensure that a multiplicity of modes exist. And that's because walking may be ideal, but many places are very far from the ideal. And cycling and public transport can expand access by 5 to 10-fold. So when you bring these two frameworks together, the proximity to a mix of different services, while also having places be grounded in walking, but a multiplicity of modes, what you essentially get is the 15-minute neighborhood connected by 10-minute transit. With these two frameworks, the 15-minute neighborhood and 10-minute public transport, we're able to build the enabling conditions for babies, toddlers, and caregivers to thrive. These two frameworks form the basis for improving access that is so critical to fostering caregiver well-being and early childhood development. In the next module, we will go deeper into these frameworks, the 15-minute neighborhood, the 10-minute public transport, as well as local mobility, to discover what are the elements and components in each to deliver improved access. We look forward to seeing you there.